right. It's great to be with you all today. Joel did a really, really good job, and I'm going to reiterate some of the things he said and try to expand on some others. My topic is choosing the right cover crop. So, yeah, when I have retired from University of Georgia, but when I was an extension specialist, I got this question, what's the best cover crop? Many, many, many times. And you all know that there's not any one answer. So I think what Joel did and what I'm trying to do is give you some things that you need to really talk with your producers on, or farmers if you're on this. These are questions you need to ask yourself, and I could not agree more that you need to develop a plan in advance, and then, like everything else in farming, you modify it on the fly. So what do you want your cover crop to do? What is your crop rotation? What kind of equipment do you have to manage it? What kind of soil do you have? What kind of fertility do you have out there? And would a mixture be better than a single species? Those are the things that I'm going to try to just touch on today. All right, so what do you want your cover crop to do? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about this as goals or cover crop function. I've just thrown up a list here of things that are commonly goals for people. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this, but I do want to say that, I mean, you can see, can y'all see, Dan, can they see pictures and the pointer moving? Yeah, can you see that blowout? Oh, no, can't do that. Okay, let's go back.
Yeah, you can. Sorry, I had to unmute myself, and that disrupted your screen. So yes, they can see all that. I'll leave myself unmuted if you have further questions.
Well, it's jumped. It's not going back. Come on. All right, great. So we've got erosion, we've got building soil organic matter, and there's a lot of other benefits that are related to that in terms of reducing compaction and increasing water holding capacity. We have a goal perhaps of preventing nutrient loss. Weed control is a really big one, both winter and summer weeds, and then creating habitat for beneficial insects, and also suppressing diseases and nematodes. And then, you know, nitrogen, providing nitrogen from legumes is a big one. So what you need to do is think about what your primary goal or goals are, because that's going to be the first thing that's going to help you hone in on what cover crop species might be the best for your particular operation. This lag is entertaining. There we go. All right, well, no matter what your goals are, biomass is really critical. And for many of those goals out there, it's extremely important, and your above ground biomass is related to the amount of below ground biomass that you have, which is really important. And I just threw this up to remind you that timely planting really has a big effect on biomass. And you can see the difference here in cereal rye planted in October versus November versus December. And this is even more important when you get into thinking about your legumes, where your your clovers and that sort of thing really need, I'm sorry, this is, there we go. All right, so your clovers and legumes really need time in the fall to develop the root structure to support their summer growth. So again, you can see in this picture that the early planted legume biomass, if you're waiting till November or December, you're really not going to get the kind of biomass that you need. The other thing that you do need for maximizing benefits is to think about keeping a living root in the soil, because what research is showing us is that above ground biomass is important, and particularly for weed suppression and some of the benefits that cover crops provide. But to really get increases in soil organic matter, that root, at the turnover of the roots and root exudates are really important for building soil organic matter. All right, so then let's look at what is your crop rotation. You know, typically, what this does is helps you identify a window that you can plant your cover crops. And we think largely about the winter months and cool season cover crops, but Joel talked about summer cover crops, warm season cover crops, and we do have a real window in a lot of systems for that after corn harvest. And you can see in this picture, the yellow flowering plant is sun hemp, and the one in the foreground is cowpeas. Both of those are warm season legumes that can do a lot for providing nitrogen for a subsequent crop. And I do know farmers that will harvest corn and then plant some warm season cover crops or mixtures before wheat. The other thing in terms of thinking about your crop rotation is the timing of your cash crop and what the cover crop variety is. And again, I want to echo what Joel said. I think we're learning that picking the right cover crop variety to match to your system is really important for success. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to plant cereal rye. You need to think about what varieties perform well in your area and what your how you're trying to match up this window. So for example, if you're planting corn, an early, crop that's planted early in the season, you want to think about getting an early maturing cover crop that works well in your area so that you can maximize biomass. So for example, with corn, we might want to go to AU Robin, which is an early maturing crimson clover, or Florida 401, which is a cereal rye that matures early in some sort of mixture. Sometimes the brassicas can be useful in corn because they do flower early, and we may not be wanting to use those so much in cotton because they flower early and set seed early. So we might be leaving seed in the field that we don't want to if we use those brassicas with a later maturing, or a cotton and soybeans that we plant later. So, with cotton and soybeans, we want to look at a later maturing varieties. Ren's Abruzzi is an old standard rye, and Dixie would be a later maturing crimson clover. Those are just examples. The other thing that I think we need to recognize with cover crops in terms of crop rotation is just like with your cash crop, you want to rotate between plant families to not build up insect pests and diseases. So, I mean, you don't want to use a cereal, rye, corn, wheat, and just stay with things in the grass family. You may want to think carefully about using something like tillage radish if you're going to be planting canola or other brassicas as a cash crop, because of the potential for a disease bridge there. It goes back to Joel's comment about first do no harm. So, you know, you may want to think about something like crimson clover before corn, you know, providing nitrogen, then going to rye before cotton for summer weed suppression, or rye before soybeans, you know, trying to rotate between plant families. I've also thrown up a little example. I know most of you all are interested in row crops, but in terms of vegetable, you know, oats, Austrian winter peas that are early for sweet corn and give some nitrogen, and maybe sun hemp before fall broccoli. These are just things to think about. Now, I am going to skip this section or just go through it really quickly because Joel did an excellent job with this, but I do want to emphasize that you need to understand how you're going to plant it, how you're going to terminate it, and how you're going to plant into it before you get out there and get a cover crop out there. I will say, in terms of planting, you know, we've got a lot of options out there. People plant green, or they can plant after it's been desiccated. We generally recommend don't try it in between because you'll get a lot of wrapping. You have got to have good, sharp cutting coulters out there. And a lot of the folks that I have worked with are big believers in row cleaners. You can roll and crimp and then plant, or you can plant and then roll crimp. I've shown you a picture here of soybeans planted into standing cereal rye that we had some problems with, but largely due to deer grazing. Well, that's interesting because I did not even change that slide. But we'll run, so I'm going to run back up to this slide before, because I really want to tell you all that there are as many ways to do this as there are farmers, probably. So I'm going to recommend this YouTube video of 4 farmers share their secrets. These are 4 very experienced farmers in Georgia that are going through their planting rigs and how they do things. And I highly recommend it to you for some tips. All right, soil type and fertility. You need to think a bit about what you've got in your fields. You know, I hope everybody's doing their soil testing and keeping up with their pH and their phosphorus and got decent fertility. But there are things to think about. Different species sometimes thrive better with, you know, you're going to have better luck probably with rye than some other grains, or certainly legumes if you've got a lower pH. The legumes definitely need a more neutral pH, and they need phosphorus out there to perform well. And I don't know who's changing my slides, but it is not me. So we'll move on to cover crop mixtures. And this is an area that, you know, there's a lot of interest in, and there's a lot of farmers who have had good experiences in this, and I think there's also a lot of hype out there, to be frank. So cover crop mixtures, the interest in that really first started from some work that Dave Tillman did out in the prairie, showing that if you had, I think it was 8 to 10 species, you had more productivity on that prairie than a single species. So, you know, that was great ecological work. And then there were folks in the Dakotas, farmers who took that, who are farming basically in a prairie ecosystem, and they've been very successful developing mixtures that work for their farming systems. There is research out there, and the theory is that if you have this diversity, biodiversity in your cover crop, you can increase soil carbon and increase the microbial biodiversity, and there's thought to be benefits of that. You also can get more than one function by having these different species, and there is some information out there that in particular systems you can have increased yields. All right, so I'm ready to go to the next slide. So here's some really, I think this is a really cool picture, and this is work coming out of Penn State. And on my screen, the credits are cut off, but it's work out of Penn State. And it just shows you the difference in both the root structure and the above ground structure for these different cover crop species. And so you'll first look at triticale, and you know we typically go to grains for a good nutrient scavenging and erosion prevention and weed suppression with above ground biomass. And you can see that with the triticale, we've got a lot of roots out there, not only in the in row, but they have moved out into that between rows section. Whereas if you look at crimson clover, we just don't have the same amount of roots, and they tend to concentrate more in the in row. And again, with canola, a different root structure, much a more prominent tap root, and you can see those lateral roots spreading out, but again, they're more concentrated in the in row area. So then they looked at the three-way mix, and you can see that you've got a more layered, above ground type canopy, and you can see you've got a real diversity in root structures below ground. And what they see is that with that three-way mixture, we are indeed getting more roots in the system than compared to a legume monoculture, but maybe not as much out there in the between row area as just a grain. So it gets back, I'm ready to switch now to, so this is kind of what I was saying. So what they saw in these studies were increased soil carbon, increased roots compared to the legume. They did see some of the mixture could produce as much above ground biomass as some of the monocultures, and they saw increased productivity fall in the following corn crop. We do have some studies at University of Tennessee also where they saw soybean yields increase after mixtures compared to single species after 3 years. I will point out that both of these studies were on much finer textured soils than we tend to have in the coastal plain. And they do attribute a lot of the increase in yields to an increase in soil organic matter, which we struggle to deal with. So let's change the slide. So I think what this is starting to point to is that adding species can provide more functions, right? But we may not maximize any one function. And I'll give you the example of summer weed suppression and no-till. So we know we need, really 8,000 to 8,000 pounds of persistent biomass to really deal with weeds like Palmer amaranth. And in that case, a mature cereal rye really fits that goal well because it can put on that amount of biomass, and it has a high carbon nitrogen ratio, so that above ground biomass really persists long into the growing season. But it also can immobilize nitrogen early. So, if we're getting that amount, 8,000 pounds of biomass, we probably need to be adding about 30 pounds of nitrogen when we plant to help with that. Or we could put a legume in with that grain that helps decrease that risk of nitrogen immobilization. But then we may not suppress the summer weeds as effectively because those legumes tend to decompose or melt, as people say, very quickly as in the cash crop growing season. All right, next slide. The grain legume mixtures have worked well. We've got a good bit of research on them. I'm showing you here an oats, AU Robin, crimson clover that we used before corn and had really good success with. You can see the winter weed suppression by looking at the bare plots kind of towards the background. We got, depending on the year and the plot, anywhere between 60 to 80 to 90 pounds of acre per nitrogen from that mixture. The grain tends to slow the release of nitrogen and help it synchronize better with when the corn needs it. Next. One other thing to realize about mixtures, and this is what Joel was talking about, that what you get out of those mixtures is very much influenced by the growing season and even the field and the fertility of the field. You're going to have high nitrogen situations favoring grains, low and somewhat brassicas that are good scavengers, and low nitrogen will favor your legumes. I know this is a vegetable example, but it's the best I have. We used an oats Austrian winter pea mixture, and you can see in those clay soils that had been managed organically and had pretty high fertility, the oats dominated the mixture. You can see in the right-hand slide down in the coastal plain where we had sandy soils and very low organic matter, we didn't get any oats at all. We just got the Austrian winter peas. So you will have different, that's with the same seeding rate and the same week that it was planted. So you are going to get different responses in your mixtures to growing conditions. Next. So I think what we really need to think about with mixtures is what are your goals. Goes back to what are your goals? If you really have a big summer weed problem, mixtures may or may not work for you. You may really need to go all in on grains for weed suppression for a while. And then as that problem is taken care of, hopefully by good management, you may want to add other things. When you're talking about mixtures, you want to pick species with different functions and different root structures. You want to select those species and varieties carefully to keep your costs down because they can get to be quite expensive. Again, I've had real good success with just a simple grain legume mixture. We definitely need more work in the southeast. We've got a rotation study in Midville, Georgia that's going on right now. Hopefully we're going to get some good data out of that. I'm sure there's other stuff that's going on over the southeast, and we'll be getting better guidance on this in the coming years. Next. So, lots of information, lots of things to think about. Where do we find, how do you get help with this? And I am going to really push this Southern Cover Crops Council website. It covers the entire South. Right now we have it fully populated for the coastal plain physiographic region for row crops. We've also got the Piedmont Mountains, Ridge and Valley regions for row crops, for vegetable production and grazing. And we've divided things up this way because, as you know, what you might want to look at for row crops is not necessarily the same thing you're going to want to use for a grazing system. Next. The heart of this website is this cover crop information sheets, and I'm showing you this for the row crop systems in the coastal plain. And you can see we've got the most common cover crops used in these areas listed over on the left. And if you'll go to the next slide, this is what they look like. We're trying to give you information on recommended varieties and why. And I would also highly recommend that you talk to other farmers in your area, and because varieties do change quite frequently, but these are tried and true and available as far as I know right now. We give you seeding depth for drilled, for broadcast, aerial. You can see that we have information on termination and when that needs to be done, dry matter production, for nitrogen, total nitrogen that are due to scavenging ranges that people have seen. And then I think what is really important is down at the bottom of that second sheet is cautions. We have for each species things that you really need to think about. So hopefully this is going to be really useful for you to refer to. Managing cover crops profitably, I agree with Joel, is the cover crop Bible. But what we have done is taken that information and really tried to drill down to be more specific for row crop production in the coastal plain or whatever physiographic region you happen to be in. Next. We've also got information on, when you can plant, when you expect rapid growth and bloom, which is important in terms of when you want to terminate. Next. And we've got a lot of other information up there. You can see right now we've got a cover crop selection tool that was developed by the plant materials centers. It's pretty basic. We're working on an interactive tool that should make things much more easy. We have a section on planting and managing cover crops that give you specifics on things to think about in terms of drilling versus broadcasting versus aerial seeding. For each state, there's seed sources, there's information on termination of cover crops, planting cash crops into cover crops, and that's what I'm showing you here. How do I get good seed soil contact in that cover crop residue? There's a good video on setting up your planter, and then another video that I mentioned to you before about what these 4 farmers, just kind of different setups that they have made. We've got information on equipment rental, local experts, financial assistance. So please take some time and go take a look at this. I hope that you will find it valuable, and yeah, let me know. All right.